Britain's armed police are amongst the toughest in the world.
Put it down!
These men and women face untold dangers. And every day could be the day they pull the trigger. They rarely talk about the realities of the job or the pressures of taking a life. But now, we've brought them together for the first time to speak openly.
I carried on shooting until I couldn't see him anymore.
In this series, they break their covenant of silence.
You acknowledge fear, you embrace fear.
And reveal what it's really like to be an armed police officer.
We don't get up in the morning thinking I'm going to go and shoot somebody. We get up in the morning wanting to come home and bath the kids.
These officers come face to face with marauding attackers.
It's the most dangerous thing that you're confronted with as an armed police officer.
Lie in wait for organised criminal gangs.
Crime is changing, it's evolving.
And save the lives of innocent hostages.
Sometimes you can't avoid using deadly force.
That shot may have to be fired, and indeed that shot may be lethal.
Police firearms officers are trained to deal with any armed incident.
You're clear!
These special men and women can use potentially lethal force to tackle armed criminality and keep the peace. And as well as weapons, they're equipped with a range of skills essential for the job.
To be an armed police officer, you've got to have a certain type of character. You've got to be resilient, you've got to be able to make decisions quickly. Well, as a firearms officer, you have to be calm, you have to be confident, and you have to be prepared to deal with the most dangerous criminals that are out there.
You've got to be able to talk to people. That's the best weapon that a police officer's got, is his mouth and his ability to talk to people.
Tonight, we find out how communication is the weapon of choice when dealing with an armed siege.
The word siege has been used throughout history, but now really we're talking about an individual or a group of individuals within a building or a premises.
We explore the first shooting by specialist armed officers, the danger posed by aeroplane hijacks, and tell the story of the UK's longest siege.
I've been in siege situations where we waited days, weeks, and even months before any type of police action would take place.
We learn about the officers' range of tactics and how their aim in every armed siege is to keep the subjects alive.
Listen, Mark, I don't want you to die, and you're not going to die today.
In every armed police operation, there's a tactical advisor who is responsible for keeping the police and the public safe. In London, throughout the early years of this century, the responsibility often fell on Commander Bob Quick.
I was the rank of commander and I had overall responsibility for crime across the 32 boroughs of London.
When sieges develop, it's Bob who is called in to balance the use of force with the use of patience. And his biggest test came in Christmas 2002.
Fire your weapons from the window.
Sometimes you can't avoid using deadly force against a determined and deadly criminal.
Eli, you must come out.
He made it very clear to us that he wouldn't ever be taken alive. It was December the 26th, 2002, Boxing Day. I was at home with my family, celebrating the Christmas holiday. At that time, I had responsibility for pursuing criminals who we knew to have access to firearms or other deadly weapons.
Gun law on the streets of Britain this morning. Armed police moved in after shots were fired from a flat in East London.
The shooter was Eli Hall, a Jamaican gangster who was wanted for the attempted murder of a police officer. Within minutes of first contact, the area was on lockdown. Every corner of Eli's building was surrounded by containment officers, and Bob took charge from the central command post.
I was asked to go to Hackney and take charge of the siege. Eli Hall was erratic, volatile, he was very aggressive. He continued to repeat his claims that he would shoot any police officer that came near him.
Eli, you must come out now.
Fire your weapon from the window.
He had a pistol. There was some suspicion he may have a second firearm in the building, and he was making claims that he had a bathtub full of ammunition. I decided the strategy of containment and negotiation was the right one.
In an attempt to win the suspect's trust, police agreed for food and drink parcels to be delivered. But despite their goodwill, Eli Hall wasn't prepared to give up.
What we learned was that actually he'd barricaded the doors and some of the windows inside the flat so that if the decision was taken to send armed officers into the building, they would be rendered very vulnerable. No one's life was at risk at that point, but what we didn't realise was that actually there was another man in the building. The stakes were much higher. There was a hostage in the building. Police have a duty to protect and preserve life, so we hardened our line with him. Now was the time to make life very uncomfortable for him. He made it very clear to us that he wouldn't ever be taken alive.
Oh, police! Get down!
When armed police deal with any situation, their first role is to preserve life. So when they learn an armed man is holding a hostage, they face the difficult decision on whether or not to go in.
When it gets to that stage where an entry has to be made, that is really last case scenario. It's the most dangerous thing that you're confronted with as an armed police officer, bar none.
Over the years, there's been an array of different sorts of individuals that we've faced.
When you execute the operation, you do it at a time where the risk of any use of arms or weapons is minimised.
As far as we can tell, police have still not entered the property. They say, why should they risk their officers at this stage?
We're into our 8th day now, and you realise that you're really stressed about the whole thing.
Do you think the army should go in?
Yeah, that's the reinforcement I'm talking about.
Bob Quick was facing public pressure as armed and dangerous Eli Hall was holed up in a flat in Hackney. He was refusing to leave and had taken another man as hostage.
We were under a lot of pressure from the media who were saying, well, why don't the police just storm this building and end this thing? I was very concerned when we learned there was a hostage in there. Hall wasn't making any demands around the hostage, but the fact that he was so heavily armed and his history as a very violent individual obviously meant that the hostage was at some risk. But as it happened, I think on day 11 of the siege, much to my relief, and I'm sure the hostages, he took the opportunity to break out of the back of the building while Hall was asleep. Now, we had the gunman on his own with no innocent party in the building. Now was the time to make life very uncomfortable for him. We battened round some windows to make it cold. We sprayed water into the building to make it damp. We were now trying to freeze him out, starve him out, force him out in whatever way we could. I think he realised he couldn't stay there indefinitely in those conditions. But He resisted all attempts at reason. We even got his father out of prison, and we asked the father whether he would be prepared to talk to him and try and persuade him to lay down his firearms and leave the building. But the father in the end wasn't very cooperative and actually ended up shouting down the phone, "Don't do what the police say, don't let them take you alive."
On day 15, the standoff suddenly escalated.
Eli Hall fired again at police. I decided to issue instructions to officers that they could return fire. One officer returned fire very accurately, and it struck Eli Hall in the face. It was a really serious wound, so we were trying to get some signal from him that he was prepared to surrender. He made it very clear to us that he wouldn't ever be taken alive. Soon after, we saw some smoke emerge from the building.
Eli, you must come out now. The smoke can make you unconscious. You won't know what's going on. You must come out now while you still can.
Within minutes, flames leap from the property. Eli Hall has apparently set the flat ablaze.
Come out safely.
We had an inkling he had some petrol in the building, and sure enough, a fire quickly took hold, and during that stage, gunfire was heard. It was over. Hall's body was found in the hallway, burnt almost beyond recognition.
A post-mortem revealed Eli had turned the gun on himself rather than surrendered to police.
Any reasonable onlooker would say the police did everything in their power to try and persuade him to give up. You want the operation to end peacefully, and of course the vast majority of them do. So in a siege, the very few occasions that police officers ever have to discharge their firearms is testimony to their training, their skill, their bravery, and the mindset that we have in British policing.
The very first day of my firearms course, I remember the instructor saying, look, you've got to understand that you might at some stage have to take someone's life.
I don't believe any job that I went on, I had in the back of my mind that I would use that weapon. The inevitability of it was that the circumstances might dictate you would.
There have been people who, when they've been asked that question, they've sort of thought, well, maybe it's not for me.
To open fire and to take someone's life may be your duty in certain circumstances, and therefore it's not only okay to do that, it's your responsibility to understand that's what you might have to do.
You shoot someone because you believe at that moment in time, at that split second that you pull the trigger, that they are armed and dangerous and present an immediate threat.
It's the very last resort part of your job, but it is part of your job.
Last year, officers carried out more than 16,000 armed operations, and many involved armed subjects who refused to put down their weapons or give themselves up. These siege situations test armed officers to the limit, but the first tactic they turn to is always negotiation.
If you and I work together, we'll get you out of there safely in no time at all.
Police marksmen have been surrounding a flat for the last 4 hours. The owner, wealthy barrister Mark Saunders, has been firing his shotgun out of the kitchen window. Now, specialist negotiators are trying to calm him down, while armed officers stand poised, ready to use lethal force.
Listen, Mark, I don't want you to die, and you're not going to die today. You're not going to die today, Mark. No, nobody's putting any psychological pressure on you, Mark. You're an intelligent bloke.
Officers have learned that Saunders is drunk and behaving erratically. So more than 15 armed officers are positioned around the flat, ready to fire if he becomes a threat.
Mark, it's Sonia. I can't quite hear what you're saying. Come and pick up the phone and talk to me.
But their hopes are pinned on negotiations to encourage Mark to drop his weapon.
Mark, can you hear me?
Siege situations that I've been involved with over the years put a great deal of emphasis on using negotiation to resolve the situation, but of course, sitting behind that, the police need to have a capability to deal with sudden, unexpected action on behalf of the suspect.
But no, Mark, you're not going to do that. I don't want you to come out and fire one barrel, and I don't want you to take a barrel in the face. I don't know, I can't see you, but I don't want you to pick up the gun, and I don't want you to do anything with it. Listen, Mark, nobody here means you any harm. Nobody here wants you to come to any harm.
In most cases, it's not always quite clear that this person is suffering mental health issues. But by the same token, if a person has got a weapon, there's still a threat. You've got to deal with it as a threat, because if you relax for a minute and think, well, this is a person with mental problems, you could be the next, victim of that person, or your colleague could be the next victim.
I'm really, really worried about you. You sound really upset, Mark.
What are you doing, Mark? What are you doing, Mark? Mark, what are you doing?
When people are desperate, that's when they are unpredictable. And that it's almost like a cornered animal. They want to get away, it's the fight or flight. If they've got a weapon, they'll use it. They may not mean to use it, but they're more likely to use it.
Mark, if you can hear me, I can hear you. Mark, you need to pick the phone up. You need to pick the phone up and tell me you're okay, so I can tell Lizzie that you're okay, and your friends that are here that you're okay. Lizzie's beside herself. I need to let her know that you're okay. Mark, pick up the phone and talk to me, Mark. Mark! Mark, pick up the phone and talk to me. I heard the shots. I'm really worried now.
Mark Saunders was shot around 10 times after lowering his shotgun towards police officers. He died from his injuries shortly afterwards. An inquest heard he had been drinking heavily, but there was no other explanation as to why the incident occurred.
There are some circumstances in which you can subsequently have some feelings for people, particularly those people who've got involved in incidents as a result of health breakdowns, mental health issues. We're not immune to realising that people get into desperate circumstances because of desperate situations. But at that particular time, it makes them no less dangerous to the public or us.
I remember being an incident 3-4 days before Christmas where a guy had a firearm inside the premises, and all we wanted to do was to take that firearm away from him, and he ended up shooting himself in front of me. And for me to go home after that was very difficult, because that individual wasn't going to have that luxury, and no matter what dark place he was in, he was still a human, and the holidays were still there for us all. So yeah, it does affect you.
I think within the police, we always talk about empathy rather than sympathy. And the empathy side of things is the thing that gets to you sometimes. You sort of go home and you just think about it and you think, Jesus, I can't, what I've just seen, I don't ever want to see again.
Yes, I have gone home and I've shed a tear. But I think that's because we are human. And I think what you need to reflect on sometimes is that actually, that police officer carrying that firearm is the most highly skilled officer probably in the world. but they're also still a human being.
It's the most dangerous thing that you're confronted with as an armed police officer.
It's a nightmare scenario if you have to assault an aircraft.
It was one of those moments where you think, this has just got real.
Every UK police force has a team of armed officers who patrol daily and handle over 16,000 operations each year. And there's one type which tests their skills and bravery to the limit: the armed siege.
The word siege has been used throughout history, and it's changed in context throughout the years, but now really we're talking about an individual or a group of individuals within a building or a premises.
Your house is completely surrounded by police officers, okay? So I want you to come to the front door, with your arms up, and you will come to no harm.
This incident in South Yorkshire saw police attempt to arrest a subject who is refusing to leave an address.
If you make any attempt to engage your life, we will shoot to stop you.
It's the most dangerous thing that you're confronted with as an armed police officer, bar none, because there are unknown variables in entering a building to safeguard someone's safety that put the risk off of the scale.
It's your last chance to come to the door now! If you don't come to the door, we're going to force entry into your property!
The tactics dictate that armed officers will contain the building where the suspect is believed to be. Covering exits and evacuating the public, it can then be a waiting game, with negotiations as the preferred weapon of choice.
Do what you say and come to the door with your hands where we can see them, and you will come to no harm.
You're trying to diffuse a situation, you're trying to negotiate with somebody with what negotiation skills that you've got.
If you don't want to talk to me, turn the lights on and off in your bedroom so I know that you're all right.
I've been in siege situations where we waited days, weeks, and even months before any type of police action would take place.
This standoff lasts more than 30 minutes.
Everything that you do is actually directed towards a peaceful resolution, safeguarding the police, safeguarding the public, and obviously even safeguarding the subject.
Finally, the siege is brought to an end, and the man is led away for questioning. Extracting a potentially dangerous man from a house is one thing, but armed police have to be prepared for much bigger tasks, such as an aeroplane taken over by an army of armed hijackers.
My heart stopped for a minute. It was one of those moments where you think, shit. I thought he was dead.
2 a.m, and Afghan terrorists have taken over a plane and forced it to land at Stansted airport. Intelligence suggests they're heavily armed and hell-bent on forcing entry to the UK. Mick was a specialist armed officer with Essex Police.
We've got the plane completely surrounded. There's riflemen on both sides, in front and behind.
As the negotiations begin, no one knows if the hijackers are open to dialogue or ready to take innocent lives to get their way. The world holds its breath.
It's a case of what's their intention, how long is it going to go on for, and I'm looking at it thinking how long it's going to last for, how long you're going to be there for. These things do have a habit of escalating very quickly. So yeah, your awareness of everything that's going on is heightened. It was just a case of what's going to happen next.
What did happen next surprised everyone. 4 cabin crew made a brave escape via the cockpit windows. A short time later, the hijackers send a warning to anyone else thinking of making an escape bid.
2 people appeared at the top of the stairs. One of them was one of the cabin crew, and the other one was one of the hostage takers. and he had a weapon. At that point, the hostage taker pushed the hostage down the stairs. It was just like a sack. Everything at that point slowed down. He just slumped, no movement. My heart stopped for a minute. It was one of those moments where you think, shit, this has just got real. I thought he was dead.
If the hostage takers have killed, then the stakes are raised, and SAS units nearby will storm the plane. Steve Smith is part of the Met team, ready to assist a full-blown assault.
It's a nightmare scenario if you have to assault or go on board an aircraft where there's hostile people. The terrorists have got hand grenades, they might have booby-trapped the plane. They've got handguns, they may fire indiscriminately into the passengers or in trying to engage the people assaulting the plane. With the confusion and the darkness on the aircraft, you will have casualties amongst the passengers, it's just inevitable. And so it is the last resort. Clearly it's the last resort, and every other means must have been tried and tested before it would be undertaken.
With the situation on a knife edge, it's up to Mick to find out if the hostage is alive.
I'm staring through the night vision, just trying to will the bloke on the floor to move. Almost wanting to shout at him to move, but you can't. You can't give out your position. And I got one of them in the back saying, Mick, what the fuck's going on? Is he alive? Is he moving? It seemed like an eternity. And I just see, briefly, he lifted his leg. And I can remember saying, he's alive, he's definitely alive.
Mick is ordered to rescue the man and get him safely back to the hangar.
Going through my mind is, has this guy been thrown from the back of the plane? Is he booby-trapped? It was scary, being totally honest, but fear is a good thing. Keeps you on edge, keeps you on your toes. So, moved the vehicle forward and pulled it across the back of the plane with my side open to danger, so that the rest of the team could exit the vehicle safe side and deal with the casualty that was on the ground. My MP5 had been resting between my legs in the footwell. I brought that up to bear, ready to take on anyone that came to the back of the plane with a weapon. The team grabbed the casualty and bundled him into the back of our vehicle, and as soon as that back door shut, my foot was on the accelerator and we were out of there.
With the hostage surviving, negotiators could keep the talks going. Just hours later, the hijackers opt for arrest, rather than a violent conclusion to the operation. They were jailed before seeking asylum in the UK.
A successful mission is one where, although we've drawn our weapons, we don't have to use them. It does affect you. You do reflect on the operations that you've been involved in. Things you see, things you get involved in, but that's the same with all aspects of police work.
When armed officers attend a siege, they have to draw on every element of their training to reach a peaceful conclusion. But there are some attributes that these officers seem to be born with.
To be an armed police officer, you've got to have a certain type of character. You've got to be resilient, you've got to be able to make decisions quickly. Well, as a firearms officer, you have to be calm, you have to be confident, and you have to be prepared to deal with the most dangerous criminals that are out there.
You've got to be a team player. It's all based on team. You'll never go into a firearms situation alone.
You've got to be able to talk to people. That's the best weapon that a police officer's got, is his mouth and his ability to talk to people.
Tony Long has seen more than his fair share of sieges, spending 25 years as an armed officer.
I joined on the assumption that everyone joined for the same reason as me, and that's that they wanted to get in car chases and, you know, chase bad guys over rooftops at 3 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, it wasn't an aspiration to shoot anybody. It wasn't something that I particularly wanted to do.
Indeed, back in 1985, no specialist officer had pulled the trigger. But that was about to change.
We knew that he was holding a little girl hostage. He was going to just try and take us by surprise and with a knife fight his way down the stairs and escape. He's shouting, "You've done it now, you've done it now, she dies, she dies, she dies."
It's Christmas Day, 1985. Pointer Court in Northolt is about to have the festivities interrupted in the most violent way.
Fuck you, Mom! Smack around the back! Fucking blow it, you lot!
We knew that a guy, I don't think we even knew what his name was at that time, had murdered a woman and was holding a little girl hostage. He'd stabbed her 14 times and thrown her body out onto the balcony just as the police arrived. The situation was contained and negotiators arrived, started talking to Errol Walker, and they started to encourage Errol Walker to come out on the balcony. And he got braver and braver and braver. Sometimes he'd come out on his own, leaving the child in the flat. Sometimes he'd come out and he'd sit the child with her legs hanging over the balcony and start talking crap to the crowd.
Negotiators experimented with tactics, using Walker's wife to try and talk him out.
Come on, stick your fucking hands up!
The negotiators had sent Errol Walker's wife forward to talk to him, and he'd actually jumped out of the window with the knife in his hand and actually nearly succeeded in dragging her back into the flat. Now, all of this is totally contrary to standard operating procedures around sieges. You know, we want that suspect contained. What the hell the negotiators were even thinking of. You know, don't get me wrong, I can quite see why they would want a negotiated settlement, but they weren't getting a negotiated settlement. Errol Walker was as mad as a box of frogs, and he was loving it. They were giving him everything he wanted. He wasn't about to surrender anytime soon, why would he?
With one murder already committed and a child in immediate danger, Tony's firearms unit take position to secure the balcony.
Fucking Mom, smack around the back! Fucking blow it, you lot!
Errol Walker wasn't happy about armed police being there. He was complaining about them, he wanted them withdrawn, he wanted us to go. At one point, the negotiators approached the on-scene commander and actually asked that we should be seen to pack all our kit up in our bags and leave, because Errol Walker had promised that if that happened, he'd come out. Really? So the negotiators said, we don't want them on site. So we'd been forced into hiding.
Tony is tucked into a communal stairwell with the rest of his team in a flat on the opposite end of the balcony. Neither group have line of sight on Walker, so a sniper, positioned 50 meters away, has the task of letting cops know what's going on.
He took a kitchen knife and cut the poor little girl's arm down to the bone. He'd hung the child out the back window by her ankles 3 stories up so that her blood dripped down on the fire crew that were waiting to catch her if he dropped her. God only knows how traumatised she was by watching her mother brutally murdered. Her mother was stabbed 14 times by Errol Walker in front of her, and then to be held hostage by him and be brutalised in the way that she was, you know.
With the siege well into its second day, there is still no sign that Walker is ready to give up. In fact, he is spiralling out of control.
On one occasion, he came to the door and he acted in a way that he hadn't acted before. He had a knife in his hand. He was at a crouch, he was looking left, he was looking right. And when he'd been out on the balcony on a previous visit, he'd seen an abandoned police riot shield and obviously thought, well, that would make an additional defence for those barricades. And the guys on the other side went, fuck, he's going for it. So they went, go. By the time they actually got out the door, Errol Walker was 3/4 of the way back to the flat door with this riot shield. And he threw the riot shield in the face of the lead guy and managed to get in the door and slam it in their face. And on the other side of the door, he shouted, you've done it now, she dies, she dies, she dies. I could see the glint of the knife up here, and he's screaming, she dies, she dies, she dies. And I had made a decision I was going to have to shoot him.
It's Boxing Day, 1985, and Tony Long is among officers facing an armed siege in Northolt, northwest London. Erratic knifeman Errol Walker has murdered one woman and taken a 4-year-old girl hostage. A failed attempt to get between the armed man and his victim has led to a dramatic standoff.
Threw the riot shield in the face of the lead guy and managed to get in the door and slam it in their face. The team leader who was at the door could hear Errol Walker saying, you've done it now, she's going to die. So he made the very bold decision to say, right, fuck it, we're going to go for it.
Tony is the first officer seen here going through the window.
Our stun grenades at the time were very, very powerful. And they'd blown out all the glass in the windows in the property, and they'd blown all the light bulbs. So when I got in, there was a bit of light coming through a crack in the curtain. And I could see Errol Walker down on the settee. He got the little girl and he was holding her across him like a shield. And I could see the glint of the knife up here. And he's screaming, she dies, she dies, she dies. And I had made a decision I was going to have to shoot him. Exactly as I fired, he stabbed this knife right down to the hilt into her neck. And I fired 2 shots at his shoulder, and what he did is he sort of winced and turned, and he exposed his temple to the light, shaft of light coming through. And I decided that he was still a threat and I needed to fire. My round actually struck the tip of his shoulder and sort of went into his brain, and his eyes rolled up into his head. And I thought, That's it now, mate. You've done it now. You've killed a bloke. She was just completely limp. I thought she was dead. And I also thought that there was a possibility that one of my rounds might have hit her, and it might have been me that killed her. So I applied a first aid dressing to her neck. I scooped her up and I ran for the front door of this flat and then took her down the stairs and handed her over to the ambulance, and they took her away. I was in such a rush to get her out of the house that I still had the gun in my hand. And so there I was, standing amongst this quite volatile crowd. They're trying to get a view of the little girl, they're trying to, you know, and I've still got a gun in my hand. And so I sort of snuck it back in my pocket. And part of me wanted to go back to the room and see what damage I'd caused, I suppose, for want of a better word. But part of me also thought, you've been advised not to do that in training. You've been advised to get away from the scene as soon as possible. You've achieved that, don't go back to the scene. So I went back to our control room, which was a flat that we'd taken over. And I went through and the bacon was there, the bread was there. So I just thought, right, I'll start making bacon sarnies for everyone. So that's what I did. I just felt that I had to do something. It was a melting pot of emotions, really. And it wasn't until about 20 minutes later, when the lads came in, and somebody said something, and I've forgotten what it was about, and I said, don't worry about it, mate, he's dead, and that's the end of it. He said, no, he's not. As soon as you left the room, his eyes popped open, and he asked us to finish him off.
Errol Walker survived his gunshot wounds and was sentenced to life in prison. The little girl he took hostage made a full recovery.
As far as I was concerned, the bloke was evil. You know, to murder the child's mother was heinous enough, but to then brutalise a 4-year-old child, and then, even when the game was up, even when clearly the game was over, to choose to stab the little girl in front of me. I lost no sleep over Errol Walker. Errol Walker survived. I'm sure I would have lost no sleep had he died.
Errol Walker was the first man in Britain to be shot by the specialist firearms team, but he wouldn't be the last. Firearms officers will deal with siege operations daily, and everyone will see them put their lives on the line to keep the peace. But sometimes, the person presenting the threat is also the person who most needs their help.
When you are confronted with somebody with a gun or a weapon, it's easy to over-rationalise things and say that they're stood in front of me with a gun. But they are human beings. This is somebody that ultimately might just need help. Take away the Hollywood drama, take away the television. When it's real, when you're on the street, your ultimate aim is to preserve the protection of the public, but also the person that you're dealing with. And yes, they might have a firearm, yes, they might have a weapon, but it's not your job to end their life, it's your job to bring that whole incident to a safe conclusion.
As I ran across the road, that gun came up in my direction.
What did I do now?
One of the high-risk situations, certainly in my career.
Oscar, this fucker's shooting at us with an AK-47.
I can remember thinking, I hope it's quick.
I thought I was going to die.
I could see that gun come up. I could see the barrel pointing at me. And he fired.